Thank you so much for being here. My name is Stacy Lewis. I'm our Chief Development Officer, and welcome to our second annual Reimagining How We Age series. Tonight's talk is the second in our second annual, Creating the World We Want to See, Tikkun Olam and Palliative Care. Okay, so for those of you who are new to our campus, I see a lot of familiar faces, and I'm so glad that you're here. But just in case it's your first time or you're not that familiar with what we do, I wanted to just take a moment to share a little bit about the incredible work we do here. The San Francisco Campus for Jewish Living is proud to offer a comprehensive continuum of care, supporting the needs of older adults at every stage of elderhood. This includes our Frank residences, where you are right now, our state-of-the-art assisted living and memory care facility, the Jewish Home and Rehab Center, providing rehabilitation for patients after they leave the hospital, and long-term skilled nursing, and a specialized acute geriatric psychiatry unit. Combined, we serve more than 500 patients and residents on campus every day, and more than 2,500 over the course of the year. Tonight's event is part of a series, as I said, Reimagining How We Age. And each session closely aligns to our guiding principles, community, compassion, and excellence, with a particular focus on topics that are highly relevant to older adults. We're grateful to bring in subject matter experts to highlight the latest research in aging and to foster community engagement. As we explore new ways to enhance the lives of older adults and create space for collaboration and discussion, we ensure that as our understanding of aging evolves, so do our approaches to care. Jewish tradition teaches that every stage of life carries its own significance and value. And tonight we'll explore what happens when you or someone you love gets a terminal diagnosis and how Judaism and spirituality inform what we do next. Before we introduce tonight's panelist and moderator, I'd like to take a moment to thank our community partners who made this event possible, our generous supporters, the Julian S. Davis Lectureship Fund, and all of our foundation donors. Please join me in welcoming to the stage our CEO, Dr. Adrienne Green, and our featured speaker, Dr. Steve Pantilat.
Thank you, Stacy. I would also like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone for joining us this evening, and I am very, very excited to introduce Dr. Stephen Pantilat. It's such a privilege for all of us to be able to learn from you this evening. Dr. Pantilat is a distinguished professor in palliative care and the chief of the Division of Palliative Care at UCSF. He's a pioneer and an internationally recognized expert in palliative care. As such, he's published over 120 peer-reviewed papers and authored 24 book chapters. He runs a successful research program, and he runs a palliative care leadership center that has educated more than 200 other programs at hospitals across the country. He authored the book Life After the Diagnosis, which you'll hear a little bit about this evening, and he was featured in the award-winning Netflix documentary, The Endgame. On a personal note, I've had the pleasure of working with Steve for over 25 years. He and his team embrace end-of-life care in the same way that we embrace aging here at San Francisco Campus for Jewish Living. Our mission is for older adults to live with dignity, purpose, and joy, and my experience is that Steve has these same goals for his patients at the end of life. We titled this conversation Tikkun Olam and Palliative Care. Tikkun Olam is a Jewish value meaning repair the world. As you listen to Steve's comments tonight, I think you'll see how small changes to the way that we speak to our loved ones or those in our care will repair the world by setting the stage for us to learn from their wisdom. Please join me in welcoming Steve to San Francisco Campus for Jewish Living.
Thank you, Adrienne.
All right, so my first question is just to kind of set the stage. Can you help us understand what palliative care is? Many people have either never heard of palliative care or they're confused about the difference between palliative care and hospice. And I'm wondering if you can just help us to understand the difference.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's really a delight to be here with you this evening, and thanks for coming out. Palliative care is medical care that is focused on improving the quality of life for people with serious illness. That's the definition that I use when I speak in public. It's what I teach my students at UCSF, what we teach our trainees. And a couple of important things about the definition. One, that it is medical care. So it is medical care. We use the latest research in medicine in the work that we do. It is for people with serious illness. And by that we mean a broad range of serious illnesses like Parkinson's disease, cancer, heart failure, emphysema, interstitial lung disease. So a whole array of serious illnesses. And it's focused on improving quality of life. Really to ask the question, how can we help people, what I say when I see patients, live as well as possible for as long as possible. That's our goal. That's the universe of palliative care. Hospice is one way to deliver palliative care. It's a very specific type of service that generally happens in your home. It can happen here at the San Francisco campus for Jewish Living. It happens generally in people's homes. It does require a prognosis of 6 months as part of the way we implement hospice in America. That doesn't mean you can't stay longer than 6 months in hospice. You can. The median length of stay, so half of people in the United States who make use of hospice stay 18 days or less. So referrals to hospice tend to be very late in the game. About 35% of Americans who use hospice services for 7 days or less. So it's very late. And what I hear from my patients, and I'm sure you heard this a lot, Adrienne, is I wish I had engaged with hospice sooner, and we hear that about palliative care as well. So hospice is one way to deliver palliative care, but there are many ways to deliver palliative care. We deliver it in the hospital with a team in the hospital. We deliver it in our clinic. We provide it through video visits, telehealth, and we provide it right here at the San Francisco campus for Jewish Living, where we have a service. One of our doctors, Ann Kinderman, is here providing palliative care, working very closely with the nurse practitioner here. So that's how I think about it. You know, I often, when I'm seeing patients for the first time, I will ask them, what do you know about palliative care? And like you said, some people know it, some people don't. Some people have looked it up on Google. But I had one woman, she was 80 years old, she had Parkinson's disease, she was referred to our clinic. And I said, well, what do you understand about palliative care? And she said, well, you're the people who take patients from sick to dead. I said, that's what I said. I said, you're not wrong, but how about this? You know, I gave her the definition. It's medical care focused on improving quality of life for people with serious illness. And our job really is to help you live as well as possible for as long as possible. And she said, I like that better. I said, well, that's good, because I do too.
So, Steve, you mentioned that we have a palliative care service here and that Dr. Kinderman is the physician on that team, but we also have a nurse practitioner, JT. I'm just going to have you raise your hand.
Oh, hey, great.
Just so that folks can familiarize yourself a little bit with the people behind the service that we have right here on campus.
Super.
Thanks for joining us, JT. So clearly, palliative care is not a dark, depressing kind of field for you. It clearly brings you purpose and joy, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about sort of your journey to sort of being a leader in this field and why it's so meaningful to you.
Really, when I think back on my career and how I got to palliative care, it really started when I came to medical school here at UCSF in the mid-'80s, and long-term San Francisco residents will remember the 80s in San Francisco as a time of AIDS. And so I came to medical school here just as the AIDS crisis was really hitting hard, before we had any treatments at all for HIV. And I did my residency here as well, including at San Francisco General, and we took care of a lot of people with AIDS. And a lot of young men were dying before we were able to really make a difference in the disease. And that disease has changed dramatically. I mean, that is one of the miracles of modern medicine and science, is how that disease is really transformed. But back then, on a typical night in San Francisco General, we might admit 10 patients, 5 of whom were young men with HIV who were dying of AIDS. And in that circumstance, it was really confronting for the first time in many years, an illness that we just couldn't treat at all. You know, so many other things had advanced, intensive care units, antibiotics, treatments for heart disease. There were a lot of advances for cancer as well. And here was this new disease that we just couldn't treat. And we didn't know it because it didn't have a name. There was no palliative care service at UCSF. I'd never heard the word palliative care when I was in training, but that was the care that we were providing. We were trying to be kind and compassionate. We were trying to do all we could to help people live well with this illness, to be kind and compassionate. There were many, many challenges that people faced with decision-making, with who would make those decisions, family members who didn't know that what was going on with their children until they sort of showed up at the bedside of their children who were dying. It was really very tragic, and yet it turned out that there was a lot that we were able to do to help people live better and to treat them with kindness and to help them make good decisions and to get them good care. And, you know, fast forward to when I then joined the faculty at UCSF in 1996, I realized this is really important work. And I finally learned about this word palliative care, about a program that was funded by the Soros Foundation called the Project on Death in America. That's a catchy name, I thought, at the time, but it was training doctors and nurses and social workers in this field called palliative care that was really quite new. And I thought, this is really the work I like to do. I want to be with people who are very sick and see how can we improve their lives. And I applied and was accepted into this program and met a lot of other people across the country doing this work, and really kind of never turned back after that. And it is an opportunity to make an important difference in people's lives. You know, we all die. That is the reality. And the question is not whether, but you know, how and in what circumstance, and what will that experience be like, and you know, how can we make it as easy an experience as possible, and how can we really make the most of that time at the end, of knowing that our life is limited, and how do we make the most of that? And, you know, a lot of religions, including Judaism, like if you think about, like Yom Kippur, right? You wear a kittel. I mean, if you're traditional, you would wear a kittel. You wear a kittel when you're married, you wear a kittel on Yom Kippur, and you are buried in your kittel. And so it's this idea that Yom Kippur is supposed to be as though you're dying, right? You don't eat, you don't drink. It's as though you are dying. And the idea is, how do we, if we were to die, like we already know who's going to die in the next year, right? That's what the tradition says. And if that's true, how do we want to live our lives? If that's possible, because it is possible. And if that's the reality, the way we spend our time matters tremendously. And so part of what we try to do in our work is really help people think about what is most important. So can I tell a story? So this was, I was taking care of patients in the hospital. This was a few years ago. And we were taking care of a woman in the ICU. Her name was Mary. She had a very bad lung disease called interstitial lung disease. It's this chronic scarring of the lung for which there is no cure. And she was dying. She had a pneumonia. She was on so much oxygen we could not deliver it outside of an ICU. And it was pretty clear to all of us that Mary was going to die soon. So on rounds one morning, I asked Mary a question that I ask my patients, which is, when you look to the future, what do you hope will happen? I'm really trying to get at what is most important to someone. What is the kind of essential things they care about? And so I asked Mary, when you look to the future, what do you hope will happen? And she said, well, I want to see my daughter get married. I said, okay, well, that's really important. Tell us about that. She said, well, she's getting married in 10 months in the Napa Valley. And I immediately thought, I just don't see it. I mean, I can't see that she's going to be alive in 10 months, honestly, and I don't see how she's ever going to leave our ICU. And so I shared that with Mary. I said, you know, Mary, this is really important, but I have to say I'm really worried about this because of how sick you are. And I think if this is going to happen, it needs to happen soon. And her daughter was there, and she said, I agree. I'm going to get married here in the ICU. And sure enough, 3 days later, Mary's daughter came to the ICU in this beautiful white wedding gown. And her fiance was in a tuxedo. They put a corsage on Mary's hospital gown. Our palliative care chaplain officiated at the wedding. There was family and friends, nurses, respiratory therapists, doctors, not a dry eye in the ICU. It was a beautiful wedding. It was not the Napa Valley. If you've been to the UCSF hospital, you know that. But it was beautiful. And Mary got to experience the thing that was most important to her because we asked about it. And it really helped her achieve that kind of most important thing that would have been lost otherwise had we not asked, number one. And two, had we not had the courage to say, you know, if that's important, you need to do it now. I think for all of us, it really raises that question of what do we want to do now, knowing that time is limited for any of us. And that's, you know, that's such a big part of the work that we do, Adrienne. And so it is, you know, rewarding that way. And it's an experience that people remember. It's a very intimate experience. You know, the end of life is a very intimate experience. And to be with families and to be with patients through that experience is incredibly meaningful. You know, it's not always peaceful, but we do our best to make it so and to make it, you know, as good as it can be, and certainly not worse for the medical care that people receive.
I think that story is a really good lead-in to the next question that I had for you. And I think all of you have probably already noticed that Steve puts a lot of thought into the words that he uses when he talks about end of life. And I was at a presentation that Steve gave probably over 20 years ago, and the thing that stuck with me that he said was, library books expire, people die. And that has always stuck with me. And it sticks with me because I think that in using direct words, we dignify people by sort of not beating around the bush and by just being honest. And I think you've already shared a little bit of how you do that already. But what I'm wondering is if you can just share a little bit more and provide some recommendations about, you know, what kinds of words are good to use, or what kinds of things should we avoid? Do you have any sort of practical advice about, you know, what kinds of things are good to say, not say?
I used to be much more of a stickler about, you know, using death and dying because that really is what's happening. And I find we had at UCSF, we had a kind of note in the chart called expired patient note. And I thought, what does that even mean for a patient to expire? Like you said, it's like a library book that expired, or, you know, milk that went bad or something. And I thought, that's not good. We can't have that. And so I talked to the person who was in charge of it, and I said, you know, this is not good. And he said, well, what do you want to call it? A death note? I said, yeah, let's call it a death note. That's actually what it is. That's what happened. I've since, I think it's okay to use pass away. I think people understand what that means, but there's so many other euphemisms that I think get in the way. And my issue with it is that, you know, it's trying to cover up things that are normal and natural and just a part of life. And it can get in the way of talking about the things that are really important. These things can be hard, but I hear it both ways. You know, I hear from patients, there's a lot I need to tell my children, but I don't think they can handle it. And then I hear from their children, there's a lot of things we need to talk about with my mom, but I don't think she can handle it. And I think, that's really interesting, isn't it? Like part of our job is then to just bring people together and to think about what is in fact most important, and to help to facilitate that. And we often in our visits have, particularly when we do them by Zoom, we can have family members from around the country to facilitate those conversations. So I did notice, it's very interesting, often when one of our colleagues, this doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen that, you know, a colleague will die, and so we recognize them at UCSF. But I notice that often the formal communication at UCSF has passed away. But if you read the New York Times, people die. Like, they die in the New York Times. So I think they do a really good job with it. But it's mostly about recognizing, like, what happened. I think the same thing is true around talking about prognosis, which I find is something people are very curious about and something they care a lot about, and something that doctors can be very uncomfortable with even when we have the information. And the challenge that I find is that often people are looking for clues, like people are kind of trying to figure it out, what's going on, and they make calculations in their head. And there's this scene. Let me just share you a short scene from this movie Ikiru by Kurosawa. Has anyone seen this movie Ikiru by Kurosawa? Yeah, great. It's a great movie. It's about a post-war civil servant in post-war Japan. He's middle-aged. He's probably in his 50s. And you see him at work, and he's just working very diligently and kind of very stressed. And he develops this pain in his stomach. So he decides he needs to go see the doctor. So he goes to the doctor's office, and you can see that he's obviously very worried, very nervous. And another patient in the office just comes and sits down next to him. He starts talking to him. He says, "Oh, this is really easy. When you go in to see the doctor, you just ask the doctor what you should eat. And if the doctor tells you what to eat, you're going to be fine. If the doctor says you can eat whatever you want, that means you're going to die." So this poor guy goes into the doctor's office, and he's talking with the doctor. And at the very end, he says, "So, doctor, tell me, what should I eat?" And the doctor says, "You can eat whatever you want." And the man assumes that he's going to die. And it turns out he's right. So if you watch the movie, you'll see it's a very old school movie. There's an X-ray on an X-ray machine behind the doctor's head. And if you see the movie, you'll see that it's like a upper GI series. So he swallowed some dye, and you can see the stomach. It's an X-ray, and there's what's called an apple core lesion. So think about if you ate an apple all the way around, that's kind of what the stomach looks like when there's stomach cancer in it. That's what he has. But the doctor doesn't tell him that, but he assumes. It turns out he's right. By the way, I did not ruin the movie for you. It's not about the diagnosis. It's about what the man does in response to thinking that his life is limited. So it's about what I was talking about earlier. What do you do when your life is limited? How do you change it? And that's what the movie's about. So sometimes people get it right, but sometimes they get it wrong. And one thing I tell people, and what I write about in my book, is if you're curious, if you want to know, you need to ask. And your doctor might say, "Oh, everybody dies." Yeah, okay, got it. Thank you. That is not information that's helpful. I don't have a crystal ball, which we do not expect, right? Nobody expects to be able to be told exactly how long you have. But often, usually, we have a lot more information than we let on. And I think it's good if you want the information to press for that information because it's your life. And you should know, are we talking weeks or months or years? Because obviously that matters a lot. And it might matter about the treatment that's available, but we often have a lot more information. And so asking about that and not letting the doctor, if you will, off the hook by not answering that question. So I think the other question that I think about, I told you about when you look to the future, what do you hope for? I think the other way to think about it is when you look at what lies ahead, what worries you the most? That's another thing that we think about. What do you worry about? A lot of people are worried about a variety of things. Being in pain, for example, or a whole host of things about what that experience might be like, what their life might be like, who will take care of them, where they'll be cared for. And those are important issues for us to talk about as well. So that's I think that's sort of the flip side of what you hope for is what you worry about. Also helpful and important to think about that.
I think the one that comes up frequently is, will I be a burden on my family? I think that weighs heavily on a lot of people.
It sure does. And yeah. And yeah. One thing that comes up in that regard is, I don't want to burden my family with decisions about my care. That is something that comes up a lot. That actually comes up in surveys that people care about. And if you don't have these conversations with your family, they will be burdened by decisions about your care. That is one way to guarantee that. And the way to make sure that doesn't happen is to have these conversations in advance, to tell them what kind of care you want when you get sick. I think Rebecca Sudori was here previously. Rebecca developed a website called Prepare for Your Care. It's a whole program that guides people through decision making and will actually generate for you an advance directive with all your preferences in it that you can print out and then sign. I think it's a wonderful guide. You can watch the videos with family members, and I think it's a great way to have these conversations and think about what are the decisions that need to be made and then how you want to make them.
Yeah, I think for those who remember, Rebecca was here just about a year ago, and her website actually has Prepare for Your Care, and I think another part of it is Prepare for Their Care. So it really walks everyone through, and if you are interested, I can share the link later or during the week.
Prepareforyourcare.org. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to talk about your book a little bit, but before I ask my question, is there something that you wanted to read for us?
Yeah. I just have a small, related to what I was just talking about how we live our lives, and I just want to tell a short. I want to read just a short story that I tell in the book about my Savta, my grandmother. My Savta used to sign birthday cards with the wish that you should live to 120. Because Moses lived 120 years. And a traditional birthday wish is that you should have a long life like Moses, the greatest teacher and leader of the Jewish people. But as she got older, my grandmother changed it just a bit. In Hebrew, she switched just one letter, and the change in meaning was profound. Rather than writing, live to 120, she wrote, live to 100 like 20. Live long and live well. My Savta understood that a good life is even more important than a long life. She lived that saying, and she declined chemotherapy when she was diagnosed with lung cancer at age 93. Not all of us will live that long, but we can all live the essence of that saying by living well.
I love that. So one of the things that really resonated with me in your book, and the book is called The Life After the Diagnosis for folks who haven't seen it. But there's in chapter 9, you talk about what happens when someone receives bad news and how you sort of help your patients to negotiate through the bad news. And one of the concepts is that you sort of flip the negative thinking on end and sort of turn the negative to positive. And you encourage your patients in that direction with this advice. Ask yourself, today in my current situation, what good could come my way? What changes could I make? What unfinished business could I finish? What broken friendships could I repair? Or what wrongs could I right? You share that with this approach, there are gifts, even in the setting of a severe illness and the bad news. And I'm really struck that aligns quite beautifully with sort of the framing for tonight related to Tikkun Olam. And I'm wondering if you could sort of share your thoughts about this and even more sort of how do you facilitate or coach people to have this shift in their frame of thinking?
Well, I just want to preface it by saying that there's a time for that, and there's just a time for grief about the diagnosis. And so I think it's not something we do sort of right away. I think there's a lot of shock that comes with a serious illness diagnosis or when you get bad news. And so I don't think you can pivot sort of in that moment. But it is something that we can all be thinking about, even in the middle of the bad thing that's happening. Is that there's still lots of opportunity for meaning and connection and for love and for joy. In the hospital sometimes we'll see Christmas in September. Someone's like, oh, we're going to miss Christmas. I'm like, you don't have to miss Christmas. You can have Christmas now. Someone was in the hospital and was like, oh, my birthday's in 2 weeks. I hope I make it. I'm like, well, have a birthday party today. If you live for 2 more weeks, have another birthday party. Like, you can have as many as you want. So to really, I think it's possible to just kind of get caught in the things are so terrible space, and that's totally understandable. And even in that setting, even in the face of serious illness, when things are really hard, there are moments of joy and laughter and possibility for what can happen. And part of it is just asking about that, asking, what is it that you hope for? What have you been doing? What's important to you? What's left undone? I think these are the kinds of questions that can really make a difference to people. And it is, I don't know everyone's politics in here, but we just had an election, and there were like a lot of disappointed people. There's a lot of people who are just thrilled with how things went, but there are a lot of disappointed people. And one of the things I've been thinking about is just in the face of that, there's still a lot to be grateful for and a lot to be thinking about that is good. And I've tried to focus on that, not to minimize what I think the challenges are ahead, and not to minimize the challenges of serious illness, which are formidable as a physical experience, as an emotional and psychological and spiritual experience for the individual who's sick and for their loved ones. But to also recognize that even in that and all that bad stuff, there's still opportunities for gratitude and for awe and for joy, and to try and find those moments that really can make a difference.
So Stacy mentioned that on any given day we have over 500 patients and residents who live here or receiving care here. And in the last year, in addition to everything that's happened in the country, everything that's happened in Israel, we've had quite a lot of deaths in the community here. And that's very difficult on our residents, it's very difficult on our staff. And I'm wondering if you have some recommendations for how we can think about that as a community. Are there different ways or things that you've seen done to celebrate people, sort of that we know are going to die before they die, or having celebrations afterwards? Do you have any recommendations around that?
I think it's really important to acknowledge death, that it's coming and after it's happened. And that's something we think a lot about in the work that we do, because we deal with a lot of loss. And it really does impact all of us who provide the care. And if we didn't do it, if we didn't acknowledge it and kind of find a way to integrate it, we couldn't stay in this work for a career. But that's really the goal, is to be able to stay in this work for a whole career. So every time that we meet twice a month as a team. We acknowledge the deaths. So we say the names of people who died, and we talk about them. What were their lives like? Who were they? What were their families like? What happened at the end of life? Who checked in with the family, and how are they doing? We have an annual kind of celebration of life as well. We do different rituals. One of the rituals that we do is we take a stone. I think it's like very Jewish, to take this, you put the stone on the gravestone. But we take stones and we collect them over the year for people who die, and then we use those stones at the bottom of a planter for a plant that we plant in honor of patients who died. So it's a way to sort of over the year to do it, and then to collect it all, and then to have a plant that grows. So that's another thing that we do to recognize that. On the inpatient service in the hospital, we have deaths every week. And so we do the same thing. Every morning on rounds, we start by acknowledging the people who died. And I think there's ways to do that here as well. And, I was thinking about this as well. Judaism has these really beautiful traditions around it, just Shiva. Right, Shiva is you're at home for 7 days, but people are supposed to come to you. They're supposed to bring you food. They're supposed to comfort you. There's a beautiful tradition in the days of the temple in Jerusalem, where when the pilgrims came to come to Jerusalem to pray, there were 2 doors up to the Temple Mount. One was for the people who were grieving, who had lost someone in the last year, and the other was for everybody else. And they would make circles, concentric circles, with the grieving people on the inside, the mourners on the inside, and the rest of the community on the outside. And the people on the outside would tell the people on the inside, may you find comfort. And it is a way that the community would acknowledge and comfort the mourners, and that you would know who the mourners are. We do that every week in synagogue when we say Kaddish. It's interesting that Kaddish is a prayer you have to say with a minyan. So you don't say Kaddish by yourself, right? It's this idea of community and how the community really brings comfort. So I think there are many traditions in Judaism that really recognize the power of community at a time of loss. And that the people who are mourning, don't partake in certain celebrations as an expression of their grief, but also as a way of being identified as mourners so that you can be comforted. In the U.S., we don't really do that. Some people take a day off after a loved one dies. They'll take the day of the funeral off, and they might even go to work that afternoon, but certainly the next day. And it really just doesn't acknowledge the power of grief and loss, and just what a huge issue has just happened. And so I think anything we can do to do that, to recognize it. We've done a whole host of things. I told you about the stones. I think you could do that. You could have a planter that, or a bowl that, and you can just see there's more stones over time. We had like a beautiful wooden wreath, and we tied strings on it, beautiful ribbons every time. That's a beautiful ritual as well. Over time you just see there's more and more and more ribbons, but it is a reminder of just that people we know in our community, people we cared about, people who are important to us, have died, and we want to acknowledge that. I think the thing that's really hard then is the anniversary. Nobody remembers the anniversary. You remember the anniversary, but people don't remember, and so I think there again, there is a ritual in the synagogue that at the anniversary on the yard site, you stand and you say Kaddish, and again, you remember, but the community can remember that it's a time that you need comforting. And we don't really have that in our society. But it's something important to be thinking about. I will say that hospice provides grief care. I think another reason to enroll in hospice is they provide bereavement care for 13 months after the death. And they do acknowledge the year anniversary in hospice, and I think that can be very, very, very important. The other thing I'll just say about hospice is that there was a study that looked at people who were in hospice for 7 days or more. If you were in hospice 7 days or more and died, your spouse was less likely to die in the 18 months after the death of the patient if they received 7 days or more of hospice, which is just remarkable that an intervention, a medical intervention for an individual, not only makes their care better, which it does, but it also made the care of their spouse better. There's almost nothing like that in medicine. If you take a cholesterol medicine, your spouse's cholesterol does not change. I can tell you that for sure. But here's this intervention. The one other thing is smoking cessation. So if somebody smokes, puts their spouse at risk. If you can get the patient to stop smoking, the health of their family will also get better. So that's the only other thing. So smoking cessation and hospice care are in the same category there. The other thing I just wanted to highlight about palliative care is it's been studied a lot in very well-designed, what we called randomized controlled trials. So half the people get it, half the people don't. And when you look at those studies in cancer, in Parkinson's disease, in heart failure, so in many different illnesses, what you find is that people feel better, they have a better quality of life, they have less pain, and in some studies, they actually live longer when they get palliative care. But in no study do people live shorter. So a lot of people worry, if I get palliative care, that means I'm just going to die sooner. Not true. It's actually not true. And that's why I tell patients you can live well and live long if you receive palliative care.
Great. I think you've given us a lot to think about as we have this sort of growing community here that's, founded in Jewish traditions and values. We actually do have a little memorial rock garden, a little bit different, but I think you've given us a lot to think about in terms of how we can adapt some of these traditions here for both our Jewish and our non-Jewish residents. So I want to shift now and talk a little bit about self-care, because I know self-care is important to you, and as I recall, you were talking about it long before the rest of the world started talking about self-care. And I'm wondering if you can provide some thoughts, either some recommendations from either what you do related to self-care, if you're comfortable with that, or sort of some recommendations for the many caregivers in our community. We have both professional and family members who are all caregivers of some sort in our community, and what everyone does is really difficult.
Yes. So we often say that the heart has to pump blood to itself first. So if you're a caregiver of any kind, whether professional, family, informal, you have to take care of yourself in order to be able to take care of someone else. So taking care of yourself is really important. The other thing we say is that connection is protection. So being connected to a community, being connected to other people is also very important and very protective against burnout, which can happen as a caregiver, certainly as a professional. There is a crisis of burnout in healthcare today among doctors and nurses. I think the pandemic was very, very hard on people who are already stressed out, and it hasn't really let up. So self-care is really, really important. The other thing I will say is, so I'm going to give you another saying, which is you can teach a canary in a coal mine to meditate, but it's still going to die. Which is to say that self-care is really important, but if we don't change sort of the environment in which we work and in which we are providing care, just meditation alone, which I think is a great thing to do and for which there is good data to suggest that it's beneficial, that's not enough. If you're still a sole caregiver for someone who's very sick, that's just going to be hard. And there's no amount of meditation, if you could even find a minute to meditate, that is actually going to make that okay. So we have to think about what are the systems that we have to really support ourselves, to support each other in our community. Having said that, it is still very important to practice self-care. My own practice, I guess I have several things. One, I exercise, so exercise is really helpful. It's lower stress, can lower your blood pressure. Exercise is the only thing shown to prevent dementia, so that's my thing. No amount of Sudoku will actually help you with that, or if learning a foreign language will not help, but exercise has been shown, proven to reduce your risk, so that's a good thing to do. Meditation. It was during the pandemic. It was about a month into the pandemic, and my wife was reading us the book Atomic Habits. She was reading from Atomic Habits. And she's, about how you develop habits, and you have to start small so that something you can do repeatedly. And so I thought, I've always wanted to meditate, but I just don't see I'm going to find a half hour a day. So I started with 4 minutes. I thought I could do 4 minutes of meditation, which seemed hard at the beginning, but I still do it. So here we are almost 5 years later. I still do 4 minutes, but I've been able to maintain it. So you don't have to do a 1 hour workout. You can take a 5-minute walk. That's sort of the point, anything that you can do. So meditation, mindfulness is great. There are apps for this. There's the Calm app. There are many different kinds of apps. You can get lots of resources online for guided meditations. You can kind of do it on your own. Lots of ways to do that. I think if that resonates for you, that's a great thing. Gratitude, it turns out that if we focus on gratitude, that helps too. So it's been studied that you can have a gratitude journal. So what you do is at night before you go to bed, you write in your journal 3 things you're grateful for, just 3 things. which is not that hard to do in a typical day. There's so much to be grateful for. And it kind of just focuses your mind on the good things, and it happens before you go to sleep. And so I have a gratitude journal by my bed. I've been doing this for years now. I have a bunch of them. I just save them. But I have a bunch of them and just focus on 3 things before I go to bed at night. So that's another thing to be done. I think support groups are really helpful. You can do them in person, but you can also do them online. I think those are really helpful for caregivers. You learn so much that's useful, and just being supported by other people can be really, really helpful. I think just any type of community, anything you do with other people can be really, really helpful. One of our faculty just gave us a talk. Stephanie Chang, one of our faculty members, just gave us a talk about forest therapy. So there's this whole, I didn't even know this, there's this whole body of research. I see you nodding your head, that's great, about forest therapy. It's about going into the woods. It's not about hiking. It's just about being in the woods. It actually grew out of Japan. They noticed in the 80s that people were so stressed out, and they're trying to figure out how to make them less stressed. And so they thought, well, maybe we'll just have people go out in nature. And it turns out it really helps. It really helps, like lower your blood pressure, makes people less stressed, make people feel better. And so I did notice there was like a lot of green around here, and just getting outside and being with nature. And if you can't do that, you can even look outside. It turns out she told us they've studied virtual reality, and turns out if you put on virtual reality goggles of being in nature, that's actually beneficial as well. And VR goggles are better than watching a video, which is better than looking at a photo of nature. But all of those also work. So there's something really powerful about that experience as well. And I didn't know this research. She shared it with us. But I do know that, we take our annual trip to the Sierras, and I love being in the Sierras. And I didn't think of it as like therapy, but I guess it is.
I've always felt that mountain air was therapeutic. So now there's actually some science,
Yes.
some science behind
Now
it.
your health insurance has to pay for your trip to the Sierras.
I also heard a really interesting presentation recently by a happiness researcher expert who also recommended a gratitude practice, which I thought was really nice, and I've been sort of trying to promote here a little bit. And that is that, like, when you sit down at your desk in the morning, before you dive into your inbox, to send one note of gratitude, either a text or an email or something along those lines, and to sort of see what the benefits of that are.
I love that. People don't get thanked enough. That's for sure.
So I'm curious from the folks in the audience, how many people have heard of an ethical will? Good. A few folks. Well, I want to talk about ethical wills for a minute.
Sure.
And I think that most people understand what a legal will is. And the best description that I've heard about the difference between sort of a legal will and an ethical will is a legal will bequeaths valuables, and an ethical will bequeaths values, which I thought was really nice. And ethical wills actually date back all the way to the story of Jacob on his deathbed. But they really allow people to share their beliefs and wisdom to provide guidance for the next generation. They've been used in the past to sort of convey the importance of maintaining a connection to Jewish community and Jewish faith. And I think this is a really lovely notion as an adjunct to what we talked about before, like there's the durable power that we talked about, and legal will. This would be a really nice complement. And I'm wondering if you can sort of talk to us a little bit about ethical wills and what the value of them are.
Yeah. I love the definition that you gave, sort of values. It really is about sort of sharing your story and sharing kind of your reflections on a good life and what's important. And so we do think a lot of people think a lot about like what I'm going to do with my stuff, but this is really to share your wisdom that you've gathered over the years, and to do that in a formal way, and to share that with your children, your grandchildren, your friends, and to really begin to ask some questions like, what's most important in life? If you had to do it over, what would you do differently? What do you think was most important? What are the lessons that you think were the most important lessons that you learned? What values were most important to you, and how did they manifest in your life? What do you want your legacy to be, and what do you think that is about? And sort of asking those questions that are really kind of value-laden about the things that you've learned and the things that are important to you, and writing them down, just like you would in a will about, my house goes here and my money goes there, and to write them down and then to share them. There's actually an intervention that a friend of mine, Harvey Chachanoff, who's in Canada, developed called dignity therapy. And it basically asks these kinds of questions of people who are very sick, who are approaching the end of life. It's a conversation that happens. It's recorded. And then the person doing the dignity therapy will then take what the person said and really create sort of a coherent narrative about these issues. What's most important to you? What do you think other people should know about? What values are most essential to you? What would you do differently if you had to do over? And they write it up in a kind of coherent way, let the person read it, and then share that with whoever the patient wants. And it's been shown to make people feel better, it increases their will to live and their sense of well-being. I think these are the kinds of things that I think many people do sort of informally, and it's really wonderful to do it in a much more formal and much more kind of vigorous way. And I think if you Google these things, you'll find them. There's lots and lots of questions that you can consider as you think about an ethical will and when you think about kind of what you want to write. I will say that it's something my wife and I have been talking a lot about recently, I think in the last, week, of just like what is most important. And my wife has been reflecting. She said, I'm worried about the world, but I remember that poem that says, when I look back on my life, I wish I had just worried less. And particularly because the things I worried about were not the things that actually got me, and the things that got me were not things I even knew to worry about. And so maybe I should just worry less and just live more. And that's been a bit of a mantra going through our house this week, to worry less and try to find more joy, and not in a disengaged kind of way, like, oh, everything's just going to be fine, because maybe it will, maybe it won't, but just take action where we want to take action, but not worry about things over which we don't have control.
I like that way of thinking about it. Well, we have a lot of wisdom in our audience, and I want to get to some audience questions, but I'm curious if there's anything you want to share with us before we turn things over to the audience.
Just that, in many ways, serious illness is just it's an affront, I think, to who we are and to our sense of what's right and good about the world. And getting a serious illness is really profound and devastating. And I don't take that lightly at all. We take it very, very seriously, and just how difficult it can be and what challenges it represents. And the thought about finding joy is not about ignoring the fact that serious illness it's a lot to deal with. It really does change your life in just profound ways that are very hard. And then I guess the last thing I just want to say is that when you talked about words, I was just reflecting that there's a way in our society where we talk about like a good death. We should all try to achieve a good death. And one of my colleagues says, the only good death is someone else's. And I think that's right. What I experience is that death is just filled with grief and loss and sadness. And I don't see that my job in any way is to make death good, because I don't think you can do that. Now, this may be a little definitional, but I think that telling people like we're going to give you a good death is just not something people are signing up for. It's just nobody wants that. And I get it, right? Life is what we know, and it's really, great. And so we don't talk about that. We don't use that language. I think that if you think about a good death, and the way we talk about it, I think when we're healthy, is this idea of a good death is really a reminder that life is limited. And I think if this is what it achieves for you, that life is limited, and so how I spend it matters, I think that's great. That's a good reason to think about that idea of what that will look like. Your death will almost certainly not look like whatever you imagined it was going to be. But that's okay, because it's just reminding you life is limited. But for people who are sick, that is not what we talk about, which is not to say that death should not be peaceful and comfortable and dignified. I think we really try our best to achieve that, and I think those things are really important, but it's not making it good. It's still really sad, and it's important for us to acknowledge that. And so my goal, our goal in palliative care, is not to make death good, it is to make life good, and to live as fully as you can with the time that you have. And that is really what's most meaningful. And that's what we try to achieve.
That's just a perfect summary. Thank you. All right, we're going to open things up for questions. Rachel has a microphone, and just let us know if you have a question.
Hi. Hi. Can you hear me? So my name is Jan, and I loved your movie, The End Game. There was some lines in there that I'll never forget. It was about people that are living think about something, and the people that are dying think about something. I wrote it down, but that just sticks with me. So my mother was in hospice care, and she passed quickly. But she was also offered palliative care before that, but she never received it, and I just don't understand what concrete services palliative care is supposed to offer. She was living in assisted living. I don't know if that makes a difference.
Palliative care looks like you just go see a doctor. That's what it looks like. Most of our visits are by telehealth these days, about 97% of them, because that's what our patients want. They're sick. If any of you get your care at UCSF, just getting there and parking, and it's like a hassle. And it's my own institution, but it's not so simple. So a lot of people like coming by telehealth, but it looks like any other doctor's visit, except the chances are that you'll see a doctor, and you might see a doctor and a nurse, or a doctor and a social worker, or a doctor and a chaplain. So chances are you'll see more than one, that you might have visits with a social worker, chaplain, nurse, separately from the doctor as well.
But they don't come to your house or anything.
There are palliative care programs that can come to your house if you are homebound, and if you cannot do that. We had a home-based palliative care program, but honestly, once we were able to do telehealth so well, we found that sending people out to someone's home was rarely needed. Like, we can do that, but it's rarely needed. And that the work we were doing, we could do that way. And so it looks like a visit, but the things we talk about are symptoms: pain, shortness of breath, nausea, fatigue, anxiety, depression. We ask about decision-making. How are you thinking about this decision? How are you thinking about the feeding tube? How are you thinking about the next cycle of chemotherapy? Do you want to enroll in a clinical trial? How are you thinking about dialysis? Right? So we help people with their decision-making. And then we provide support, and that's emotional, psychological, spiritual, practical support. So those are the kinds of services that we offer. It's probably similar to what your mom was receiving in hospice. It's just that happened under a very particular kind of benefit, and that was almost certainly delivered in the home, where a nurse probably came once or twice a week. You had access to a social worker as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I'm sorry about your mom. I'm glad she got hospice care.
Oh.
The way you describe it really is informed by capacity. Person has capacity to state all of these wishes and wants and nuances of their end-of-life care. And when that doesn't exist, is there really the ability to provide palliative care? What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what happens when someone kind of loses the capacity? And that happens, for a variety of reasons, either because there's something, cognitively, like dementia, or just people get very sick. So part of the role of what we call advanced care planning is stating in advance what's important to you and trying to be as clear as you can with the values that matter to you and the kinds of decisions you want someone else to make. So, prepare for your care is trying to set you up, not for today necessarily, but maybe in 5 years or 10 years. And we're working closely with our Memory and Aging Center at UCSF to really think about, for example, in dementia, what is the right way to interact and when should we be talking about these issues and anticipating decisions that might come down the road that we know many people will face so that they can tell their families in advance. But we can still care for people, and we do take care of people who are not able to interact with us. We talk with their loved ones, obviously, who know them well and whoever was chosen to speak on their behalf. And there's still a lot that we can understand about care, about, we can evaluate pain, shortness of breath, even in people who can't communicate with us, and we do try to treat that as well. But it can be much harder. It's harder for us in the decision-making side. And I will say that if you haven't told your family what kind of care you want, you're going to get more care than you might want. That's almost certain. That's what I see. Is that people are really reluctant not to provide care for their loved one. And if they're going to err, they're going to err on the side of more rather than less. And so if, in particular, if your wish is not to have those things done, like I don't want to be on a mechanical ventilator with a tube down my throat on a machine breathing for me at the end of my life, you should tell somebody that. Because absent telling somebody, that's the flow of care. The flow of care is in that direction. It's just to do more and more sometimes in a vain attempt, in a futile attempt to really turn things around. So that's why it's really important. Yeah.
I really appreciate what you said about palliative care for the person who's dying. But I think there's a need for palliative care for caregivers. And having just been one for 11 years, I feel that the literature, and even what you've said, is not enough. And I can say it from a practical point of view, meaning like how doctors and health providers treated me or didn't, and the kind of subject matter that social workers bring up. To take care of the practical aspect, I found myself really frustrated because I wanted what you say the patient needs. I wanted some kind of definition of what was going to happen. And I didn't get that. Across the board, everyone said, we can't tell. It's so variable. And that wasn't the answer. They could have said something like, these are the patterns of what you can expect. I could not get that. And then I remember we had Louise Aronson, who came and gave a wonderful talk about redefining aging into elderhood. But I was frustrated because she said guilt went with the territory. And I feel that guilt for caregivers is like because the area in which people subjectively feel is not addressed, and guilt is the consequence of it. Like, for example, in other words, self-care, massage, deep breathing is not, and meditation is not really all that's needed to be attended to. There's emotional needs, there's spiritual needs, There's how do you live a practical life? You know, the adage to just take care of yourself, you have a right to live, that doesn't do it. Take a walk, right. And I mean, I think that there are lots of questions that we deal with that should be the subject matter of, you know, help.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing your experience. I'm sorry that it was like that. You're 100% right. I think that's a big gap that we have in healthcare, is about how we take care of the caregiver. It's a huge gap. We just don't do a good job with it. There is more research happening in this area, mostly that tells us that caregiving is really, really hard and that caregivers go through a lot and they need a lot more support. And we don't have and when I talked earlier about, you know, the canary in the coal mine is still going to die, that's what I mean. Like, unless we have a system to really support people, it's not enough to just figure this out on your own. And you're 100% right. And we don't have it. And I think we look to the healthcare system, but, you know, one of the challenges is that it's not always the case that the caregiver is in the same healthcare system as the patient, and so sometimes the ability to identify and address resources is hard. We have a project where we're assessing caregiver needs and really trying to address those, but then the question came up, where do you put that information? Because we have a chart for the patient. There are just these logistical things that we are trying to overcome about how we can put the caregiver's information in the patient's chart so we can at least see it and share it among different providers. So there's a lot of practical issues. And as a nation, we do not invest enough in this area. There's a lot of places we don't invest in kind of social services. As a country, we expect individuals to figure this one out on their own. And it's not adequate. I mean, it's a huge cost. It's a huge emotional cost. It's a huge financial burden to people. The number one cause of personal bankruptcy in the United States is healthcare costs, because the person is sick, because their loved one can't work, and just the cost of healthcare and caregiving. So it's a huge issue. I don't have simple answers, but you are right that we do need way more services. It is something we try to do in palliative care, is to really acknowledge the caregiver, is to ask about the caregiver's experience. We can meet separately. Very often our members of our team, I will meet separately with people, but you know, when you said capacity, I thought you were going to talk about capacity of the team. And like, you didn't mean that, but I mean that. Like, we don't even have enough palliative care. Yeah. They don't. That's true. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
Be our
Thank
last
you.
question.
Well, I'm going to continue the line of thinking, and I don't mean to rain on your parade, but here it goes. I'm having a lot of trouble with something you said about palliative care. It sounded to me like, since you're doing 97%, that was your number, I believe, of your consults over the phone.
No, by video, not over the phone.
By video, okay. But given today's technology, it could be AI with a phony picture of a person in a video. I mean,
Except it's not.
I want to know what you said. You emphasized medical care. What medical care do you do or do you not do in palliative care? I still don't get it.
So we evaluate and treat pain. So we evaluate and treat shortness of breath and nausea. We evaluate and treat people for depression and anxiety. So a whole host of those kinds of symptoms that people experience. And so we will do tests to work them up, and we will give treatments to make them better. And I'll also say, any person who wants to come in person to visit can come in person. So we're available. I'll go to see anybody in person, but people don't want to come in person. It's hard because it's just hard to come. But we will see anyone in person. And I haven't heard about AI, giving care, but that's not what we do. Like, we give very personal care. It's me. It's me on the video talking with patients. Please. Yeah.
We hear people saying she's in hospice care. We get a feeling for what that means. But when you say she's in or he's in palliative care, how does that differ from anything else?
It doesn't. It does not differ at all. It's like saying you're in cardiology care, or saying that you're in primary care, or saying that you're in cancer care. Palliative care is just another type of medical care that people receive alongside any other treatment they're getting. So alongside their cancer care, they're getting chemotherapy for their cancer, and they're getting palliative care also, and maybe they're also seeing their endocrinologist because they have diabetes. It's just another type of medical care. It's not a concept that you're in palliative care or out of palliative care. You're either receiving it like you would receive care from a cardiologist or your primary care physician or from your oncologist. It is another medical specialty focused on a particular set of issues. Like I tell my patients, look, I'm not the liver expert. I'm not the cancer expert. You have an expert for that. But I am an expert in pain management, in treating nausea, shortness of breath, depression, anxiety. I can help you think through whether this next cycle of chemotherapy, is that a good idea based on your values or not? And I can help you, to some of the questions that came up, I can help you around meaning. What does this mean for me? What are the spiritual issues that people are dealing with? What are the psychological issues that people are dealing with? I'm not saying that my colleagues in other specialties shouldn't also do this. I think the really good ones do, but they've got a lot to worry about. They're trying to think about a lot of other things, and sometimes they don't get to it. And so we're the ones who can talk about prognosis and what to expect in the future and what's the future look like. So that's the care we provide, and it's provided alongside any other medical care that people get.
Great. Yeah, I think that we're going to wrap up, but Steve's going to hang around for a little while after we wrap up so that people can continue to ask all these amazing questions. I really appreciate everyone being here tonight, and Steve, thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about.
It's really a pleasure. Thank you all very much.